Welcome to another video. This video we're going to do something a bit more interesting with Houdini, Python and Blender. So I want to create a button somewhere that launches Blender and then sends the data that I have in Houdini into Blender. So the way we're going to do this is you can basically see this as, for example, two scripts that we are working. So in Houdini, we will have a script, and once we trigger that script, it will launch Blender, and we will also then use a script within Blender to then do a certain action like load in a certain FBX model or do this or do that. So that's what we are basically going to look into today. To get started in Houdini, we have here just an empty scene, nothing special. And what we want to do is I'm going to just make a very basic scene because it doesn't matter too much for our case what exactly we are building. In terms of geometry, it's more about the Python code and sending the data. So we have a sphere, and we also have then, for example, a couple lights that we maybe want to include as well. So here, let's place one at the top. Maybe it's like a bit bluish. Maybe increase the brightness. Let's put this to like 6 or something like that. Then let's place one here at the side or the bottom. That's maybe a bit orange. And this is then my test case scene. We can also do a camera as well, and maybe just click here, new camera, and this is then my scene or the thing that I want to export to Blender. So this is the first step, just making something simple like this. Now, second step is, first of all, where does this live and how can I create like a Python button, for example? And for our case, we're just going to use the shelf tool. So here at the top, you have all these kinds of buttons and tools. So for example, if it's just something to test out and it's not that important, we can just right click and make a new tool. If you want to create a new tab, feel free to like make a new shelf tab here, and then you will just have like an empty bar where you can create custom tool sets, of course. So here, let's make a new tool, and we can call this tool like send to Blender, for example. And I'm going to copy paste the name to this as well. We're going to press apply, and we're going to, of course, then here fill in a Python script over here. So here we will have Python code that will then do something. So I guess the first thing that we wanted to do is to select our pieces and export this. So of course, this of course means that we will need to build like a ROP system for rendering. And the way that I'm going to export this is using USD. So with USD, I can very easily have the lights and the cameras and the geometry sent to Blender. So I'm going to just switch to a stage here. And this is, of course, like a very simplified way of like implementing like or exporting a USD file. I'm not necessarily an expert on it, but this will just be working fine. So import all. So this will gather all the files from your object layer that we just created. As you can see, this is just all the files. And then we just type in USD, and then we have a USD ROP renderer. So here you'll just plug it in like so. And the main thing that I want to force here is the location where it's stored. So in my case, I'm just going to force this to be under a tools folder, and I'm going to call this a temporary scene USD file, because every time you would press this button, I want this to be like overwritten and updated sort of. So I'm just going to like force this under this file, so under this tools folder. So it's up to you where you want to save this. So just remember the location, because we will use it also for importing then as well. So when we want to then import into Blender, we probably want to have like the same location. So then we again want to like edit this tool. We have now the script again, and how can we now trigger this saving automatically? So there are a few ways on doing this. The first way is you can just drag and drop this button, and it will automatically make a Houdini like Python thing here. So it says like Houdini get parameter of this stage node called USD, and then X is the execute value, which is of course this here, the parameter execute. And then from this, what we want to do is then type in something which is called press button. So this will then trigger the button press. So if we would now try this out, so if I would now click the button, you might see like an error here of the USD node, since this is not necessarily set up correctly, but it will work for this case. now going to my tools folder, you can see I have basically now a USD scene file, and I've also here have a object file for each of the geometries or objects that we had. So this is how the USD file is now getting saved. So just the main file and then files per these objects that we had, these geometry shapes. So that is working. That part is already done. So that is not that difficult. I also can show you another way if you're interested in like how can we do this in another way is instead of dragging and dropping like this specific parameter, I can also just drag and drop the node itself. So here, if we maybe just press enter, this will then just have a reference to the node. So as you can see, it's now referencing the node instead of the parameter. And other ways to now get, for example, the parameter would just be typing in parameter. And then we just do the same thing where we want to call, for example, the execute function or the button. And then we can also just use the press button way. This will also work. It's the same way, same idea, just structured a little bit differently. So if you want to trigger or need data from the node itself, I recommend using this way. So let's say I want to also gather the file path. We can then, for example, ask what is the output here? What is the output parameter here? And then we can automatically use that to, for example, give that to Blender as well. So for now, this is fine. I'm gonna maybe here, this is then save to USD path. So that's the first quick implementation of the tool. Just like have this button and you just automatically export what I want. Now, second part is how do I actually now launch another software like Blender from this action? And also what I want to show you with this video is recently you might have seen that we have something called ChatGPT. And I also wanted to show you that we can use this as well, or just get some better idea about what code we need to create to do something. So here, if we just ask ChatGPT about like, hey, in Houdini, create me a Python script that actually launches Blender. And this is then the result. So this is roughly what we want. There might be some different things that we want to do here, but it's basically very close to what we want. So we will import the subprocess, then we will target where the actual Blender file is located. So if you installed this in the default location, it might be similar like this. Then in this case, it's also targeting a Blender file as well, which we don't want to use really, because we just want to target the USD file rather than forcing it to open an existing Blender file. And then here it's going to build a command line, which has then the Blender path and the file. And then we just ask it to execute the command line, which will tell it to just trigger the Blender to open and to load the file. So I'm just, for example, can copy the code. We can paste it in over here, but we need to modify this probably. First of all, I'm going to place the import here at the top. Then I might just call this like Blender part, just so we know that everything down here will be based on Blender data. And then I want to strip away the Blender file. I don't need that. And I want to just say that we just want to launch Blender. So we're just going to give this the location where Blender is. We've also double checked the location of my Blender, which is then of course similar because I installed it in the default location, which is program files, Blender Foundation. I have, for example, 3.4. So if you have different versions, that might be different. And then I use the launch exe file to use it to launch Blender. So let's hit apply, accept, and press this button, and hopefully Blender will launch. And as you can see, as expected, it actually did launch. So here we have our Blender with the basic scene, the cube, and the light, and the camera, and this is close to what we want. So the next part will be then thinking about how can I, for example, in Blender, make a script to actually ask it to open the USD file. So for that part, what we can do is maybe we can delete everything here in this scene, and we can grab here our text editor. So going to text editor, let's just make a new scene here, like a new text scene. And here we're going to like preview or template our code a little bit. So I'm going to write the code. So you can write the code here in Blender, or you can write it in like Visual Code as well. But writing it in here means that we can actually just easily like hit the run button and we can see if it works. So here we will just do, for example, so import the Blender library that we want to like say to Blender like, hey, launch the import of a USD file. We probably need to have like a string value where the file is located. So let's create that. So here, where is this located? And if you remember, this is just going to be a bit hard coded. So this was saved under my tools folder called temporary USD scene. Now, how do we actually then use USD importer? If you go to the Blender API documentation, we can then basically here search for a USD. So doing that will give you some options. So here we have actually this one, which is saying like the USD import, and then it has like a bunch of values that we can use. So what we are mainly interested in is basically importing the USD and giving that basically the file path where it's stored. So let's just copy paste that. So in here, we paste that line of code, and then here I just want to give my object file, plug that in over here, and when I press this run button, it will now, as you can see, load in the USD file. So here, if I would play with the light, you can see that we have the blue and that orange light at the bottom. So this is basically working as expected. So I have everything that I had in Houdini now here in Blender by using a USD file. So this is like the little code that I would require to fully implement this. Now to do things a bit more properly, we're gonna, for example, go in Visual Code. We're gonna make a new file and I'm gonna copy paste a new file, and I want to copy paste what I had in Blender. So select everything here. We're gonna paste this and we want to then save this under the tools folder, for example. So I save this here under the tools as well, where you just have like import Blender USD Python file, which has this lines of code. Now Blender itself can actually now be closed, so we don't need to save this. And in Houdini, we want to now go here and edit our script. So how do we now launch this Blender and add that Python script to it? So again, for the people who are interested in using ChatGPT, this is what the code would give me, asking it to add the option to also launch a Python script with this. And basically what we will need is this last part that is also here included to the command line. So we will just say like, hey, we want to use Python and launch that script with it. And then we of course have a reference to that file. So we can now copy paste this part, and then over here we're gonna just add that, and here we want to then of course create a Python script variable. So here we're gonna create a Python script, and similar to what we've done before is we need to say where does this live, which for me is the tools folder and then the import Blender USD Python file, and that will be it for that command line. So again, pressing accept, and let's see if this works. And as you can see, it actually did load my file. So it did load the USD scene. It had lights, camera, and object. Now, the only thing that I don't like is that we still have those default cubes and scenery elements. So either you try to like set up the default scene of Blender to be empty or something like that, but we can also encode force objects to be deleted or check if there are objects and delete them. So now that everything is set up, we can basically start to expand on the Blender file. We can make this a bit more advanced. Right now it's pretty bare bones. I'm not going to go into much more detail as this is a quite a basic introduction video to a lot of these things. So now how do we delete all of the objects in Blender? There are probably like a couple different ways on doing that. So I will just show you one way how it works, how you could do it. So let's make some room here, and I'm going to just say delete objects in scene. And then here we're just going to basically then say import USD scene. So what we want to do is going to just make a variable called all objects, and this is equal to, you can look up the documentation. So we want to do Blender opt dot object dot select all, Here I want to type in action equals select. And this will then, so this value will hold all the objects of the scene. And we want to then basically do a for loop. So for each object in all objects. Then for each object, we basically want to then again use the Blender Python ops. Then we want to use the object and say to delete that object. So we'll basically loop over these objects and delete them. So let's save this and let's try again. So we can close Blender, of course. And here again, let's click this button. And if everything went right, we basically now have that scene again. So that is working. If you quickly want to test this out, if the exporter is updating or working as well, we can quickly go to our object layer here. And maybe we can change the light, something like that. Can change the light here from so, or maybe bring it a bit like this. Maybe we can add a different shape or do some, maybe do a quick mountain noise or something like that, disturbing the shape a bit. So we have a shape like this. So again, we are happy with what we created here, and then we just say like, hey, send this to Blender. And now we have the same here in Blender. If we look at the results, I moved the lights, I changed the shape, and that of course is now being translated here as well. So that's pretty nice. We also have the camera, so I can go into camera view. The camera seems a bit off, so we might need to change that. I guess the focal length is probably wrong. So I need to set this here manually. There might be some weird things still with USD, like the USD setup that I created in Houdini was probably not perfect. It was pretty basic. So there might be some things we want to like improve or change, or just general USD workflows might still be a bit in early stages. What we have here now works perfectly. You can see that we did not had to do a lot of like coding to get this implemented. So that was it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to like and subscribe, and see you on the next one.